Thank you, John, and good morning, everybody. Yesterday was Mount St. Helens Day, the 18th, and the 38th anniversary of that big event. Now, how many here saw the eruption of Mount St. Helens? Quite a lot. That's good. Well, we remember it. Connie and I were at the coast, and we heard it erupted, and then on the way home, we saw it fairly well. And of course, throughout that summer, there were a lot of interesting things that happened, several other lesser eruptions and so forth. Well, creationists, have talked a lot about Mount St. Helens, and it's been a very helpful topic to us. And much of the discussion, has been about the geology of Mount St. Helens. But what I want to do today is to talk not about the geology particularly, although we'll refer to it, but to focus on the biology of Mount St. Helens. So with that, we're going to go ahead with a series of slides, and I've got lots of slides, so pay a lot of attention to looking at the screen, more than me, I think. So the topic is biological recovery at Mount St. Helens. The flood in the days of Noah, which according to the Bible was global, catastrophic, and occurred only a few thousand years ago, disrupted all biological systems on the entire planet to an incredible degree. The natural world, you might even say, was put through a blender. Genesis chapter 7 describes the biological impact this way. Every living thing that moved on the earth perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had the breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the face of the earth was wiped out. Man and animals and the creatures that move along the ground and the birds of the air were wiped from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those with him in the ark. And likewise, the Apostle Peter, referring to the flood, says, whereby the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Yet amazingly, over the tens, hundreds, thousands of years following the flood, plants, animals, and other organisms recovered, producing the ecosystems we see on the modern earth, like this magnificent old-growth forest in the redwoods in California. But you might say, is such a belief reasonable? Is the biota really that resilient? Could biological recovery actually occur following a global cataclysm on the scale of Noah's flood, especially within the biblical time frame of only a few thousand years? And if recovery did occur, how did we get from there to here? That is, from barren flood and volcanic sediments worldwide to old-growth forest, tropical rainforest, savanna, desert, Arctic tundra. By what ecological mechanisms could such remarkable transformations take place? And to answer these questions, we must begin by asking what possible sources of information we have that are available to help us. And I've listed the 5 main ones here. First of all, the Bible, also possibly other ancient records other than the Bible, the geological record, certainly, and a discipline called biogeography, and also the study of modern biological disturbances. Let me mention each of these very briefly. Now, here is where we begin our study with the Bible. Of course, the Bible doesn't tell everything we want to know. It is true, but not exhaustive in what it says. Just try looking up biological recovery or Mount St. Helens in the concordance. It gets you nowhere. But the Bible is our foundational source of information. It's where we start in attempting to understand biological recovery. It gives us the big picture, the proper worldview, the framework in which to fit our scientific observations. For example, the Bible, in no uncertain terms, teaches that the surface of the earth was once destroyed by a global cataclysmic flood event, and that afterwards life really did recover. Now, the left part of the slide summarizes what I know about non-biblical ancient records as a source of information on recovery following the flood. I really know of none, so I left a question mark there. I did find the book on the right, however, interesting. It doesn't tell what happened after the flood. It doesn't mention the flood. But what it does is, it, I think, tells what the final product of recovery was in many places on Earth, at least. And the book is called A Forest Journey by Mr. John Perlin. And Mr. Perlin collected old documents which indicate that areas like Mesopotamia, Iraq, Greece and Cyprus and Crete and Spain and Italy and many other places that are rather devoid of timber today, not a lot of dense forests, but that at one point in their history they were heavily forested. And it seems reasonable to think that for much of the land's surface of the earth following the flood, the end result of recovery was some sort of a forest. Now here we see Grand Canyon, and some of you have been there and seen that certainly. And much of what we know about the flood, of course, comes from studying the geological record. And here we see that record. It's recorded in the sedimentary layers, for example, of Grand Canyon. Each layer has a name, like the Kaibab limestone and the Coconino sandstone and the Redwall limestone and so forth. And they all contain fossils. And so geologists will read these layers sort of like you and I might read the pages of a book and learn a lot about what the flood was like. And an understanding of what the flood was like aids us greatly in understanding how biological recovery would have occurred. Another source of information would be the discipline called biogeography. It's the study of the distribution of plants and animals on the modern Earth. And from observations on the modern Earth, one can speculate about how various organisms got to where they are found today. For example, why do giraffes reside in the African savanna, except for these, of course, in the San Diego Zoo, but why don't they live in Australia? Why don't they live in South America? These are questions of biogeography. And lastly, and of special interest to us today, we can study biological recovery from present-day modern ecological disturbances. Things that would include wildfire, like the big burn in Yellowstone National Park in 1988, or local floods, even tsunamis, big floods, wind, even like hurricanes, which cause great disturbance of ecosystems, diseases, avalanches, glacial activity, human-caused disturbance like clear-cut logging. And, but none of these processes produces nearly the intensity of the last one, volcanic eruption. And no volcanic eruption has been studied in as much detail as that of Mount St. Helens, and that includes biological study as well as geological study. This is a 1993 bibliography on biological research generated by the 1980 eruption, and it lists 637 article references and contains 70 abstracts of research in progress. And there's much more than that written today. One would think, therefore, that a careful review of the lessons that were learned at Mount St. Helens should greatly assist creationists in trying to construct some sort of a reasonable model for post-flood biological recovery. And so this then is the topic I want to explore in the remainder of this program. Well, let's now look at what Mount St. Helens was like prior to the 1980 eruption. I'm sure many of you remember seeing the mountain and being up there even prior to the eruption. So we'll talk about its pre-disturbance state. And Mount St. Helens was once called the queen of the Cascade Range. It was youthful in appearance, snow-clad, frequently likened to an ice cream cone. It's one of the most beautiful mountains in the Pacific Northwest. And extending from its flanks on all sides was a vast green blanket that went over the landscape, thousands of acres of both pristine and plantation forest. And you can see Peaceful Spirit Lake nestled into the mountain's shadow to the north. The tranquility of this scene was deceptive, however, and the indigenous peoples understood that. You can just look at the names they gave the mountain. Tawanlatla, meaning fire mountain. Lawilatla, one from whom smoke comes. So it appears that the Klickitat and the Cowlitz and the Chinook peoples understood Mount St. Helens' true nature. The landscape around Mount St. Helens before 1980 also showed evidence of past volcanic cataclysm. Volcanic boulders littered the forest floor in many places. Igneous flows determined the course of streams, as we see here at Lava Canyon. And even much of the soil was derived from the weathering of volcanic material. You know, Mount St. Helens is one of those strange places where the soil actually falls out of the sky. In addition, timberline elevation, indicated here, on Mount St. Helens gave evidence of fairly recent volcanic disturbance. It was suppressed. It was lower than on neighboring mountains. For example, in 1980, timberline averaged about 4,200 feet, which was the lowest in the Cascade Range. Mount Rainier, not too far away, was 2,000 feet higher. Why was this? Well, it seems that timberline was brought way down to the base of the mountain in the 1800s by eruptions, the last being about 1857. And since that time, the plants have been creeping upward to reach their climatological limit, but simply have not had enough time to reach that limit. So hence the timberline was low. Besides volcanic eruption, the pre-eruption landscape around Mount St. Helens was accustomed to many other disturbances, including wildfire. One scientist wrote the following. He said, "The plant and animal species that are returning to the mountain slopes have seen it all before. For them as species, it was no unique event, and our studies of colonization must take this into account." Now, that's an important statement. In other words, before the eruption, the flora and fauna of Mount St. Helens was already adapted to recovering from major disturbance. It had already been there, done that, as the expression goes. Well, we could continue discussing pre-eruption Mount St. Helens in more detail, the geology, the climate, the plants, and the animals, but time doesn't really permit that. So let's move on from the pre-eruption mountain to the disturbance itself. It was on a beautiful Sunday morning, again, what many of you remember, May 18th, 1980, Cataclysm fell on the Mount St. Helens landscape, and the toll on biological systems was quite staggering. Act 1 of the volcano's performance that morning was something that had never really been seen before or documented before. The mountain erupted sideways, not upward as expected, but laterally over the landscape to the north. And in the span of less than 10 minutes, some people say 3 minutes, 230 square miles of this lush green forest was transformed into a gray, lifeless appearing moonscape. Point out here that that's Mount Rainier in the distance because we're looking north from Mount St. Helens. You can see the densely forested areas. Much of that is old-growth forest around Spirit Lake. That's Spirit Lake. It looks like two lakes, but it's actually all Spirit Lake. And now what I want to do is to go to a slide taken in the summer of 1980, showing approximately the same view taken not from the mountain, but from a helicopter hovering at about the same spot because part of that mountain was gone now. And so here we go. See the difference? In case you missed it. There. Pay attention to the foreground, the dense forest, all in the foreground, this side of Spirit Lake. That's going to be important here. There we go. That's afterwards. So Mount Rainier is pretty much the same, but here we have part of the blast zone, the area of destruction by that lateral blast. And you can see the forest, it looks like it's all gone, except when you look closely, it's not all gone because a good part of it is floating right there on Spirit Lake. You can see the log mat of 1 million logs or so floating on Spirit Lake. Very important is you look in the lower part of that, sort of the flattish area down there called the pumice plain. That's where that old growth forest was that I showed you on the previous slide. There in the foreground is the forest. There it is afterwards. And that area is going to be very important in our talk, so keep that in mind. Well, over 4 billion board feet of timber was felled, enough to build more than 400,000 three-bedroom houses. Most animals residing above ground died. They simply had no place to hide. Here's the death toll that was estimated by the Washington State Department of Game. And fish, counting only the salmonids, the salmon and trout, 11 million. Birds, well, every bird died. There was no way for a bird to escape the eruption. And so 1 million individual birds. Snowshoe hares, 11,000. Black-tailed deer, 5,000. Roosevelt elk, 1,500. Coyotes, 1,400. Bobcat, 300. Black bear, 200. Mountain goats, 15. Cougar, 15. In addition, 57 people were eventually determined to be dead or missing, including someone in this vehicle. Now, this is a very important slide. It's a map of the blast zone. Again, the blast zone created in large part due to that lateral eruption, but the other events of the day, of course, entered in as well. And so look at that, and you see I have an arrow. And you look at the base of the arrow, the base is right at Mount St. Helens in the crater. And then you look upward from that, which would be going north, and you see a red area. Well, that's the pumice plain. It's where volcanic material just poured out of the mountain and inundated that area. That's where that old growth forest was that I showed you. You can see Spirit Lake as the light colored material there. Then off to the left of the pumice plain is a lighter yellowish almost colored region, which is the North Fork Toutle River, and that's where the debris avalanche, that is the landslide, which included the top and north part of Mount St. Helens, where it fell and slid. It slid 14 miles down the North Fork Toutle River Valley. The tan area that covers most of this, well, that's the blowdown zone where the forest was felled. Close into the mountain, the forest, including the soil, simply flew with the blast. It was removed. But further out, the trees fell and still lay there today, where they were felled by this blast. And then you go out towards the perimeter of this area, and you see it's kind of a hatch-marked area, and that's called the scorched zone, or the zone of the standing dead, because that blast, as it went outward, remained hot enough to kill trees when it reached that area, but it had lost its power to knock them down. So it left a big zone of standing dead trees, some of which are still there today. Now, the arrow then represents a gradient of disturbance. The arrow starts in the most intensely disturbed area where you don't expect anything would have survived. And as it goes outward towards the north, it goes through areas of less and less intense disturbance until finally it would reach the unaffected forest beyond. It'd be beyond this diagram, of course. And that, of course, would be the case. Now, you might think just about concerning this gradient of disturbance, well, maybe recovery would be very slow around the mountain at the base of that arrow and get progressively faster and more complete as you go out that gradient. And of course, that did prove to be the case. That's fairly logical that it would. One other thing, any scientist now who's going to do biological research in this area has to answer two questions. And the first question is, as a scientist, you'd have to say, what is my study site? What was it like before the eruption? Am I working in a place that was once an old-growth forest, or a clear-cut, or a mountain meadow, or where am I in the pre-eruption landscape? That's the first question. The second question is, what happened geologically during the eruption in this place that I'm going to study? Am I working now on a mudflow deposit, or on the pumice plain, or on the blowdown forest zone, or where am I? So these are questions that any researcher needs to address initially. Well, several years ago, I reviewed the literature on biological recovery in the blast zone and attempted to relate it to recovery following Noah's flood. And the result was this article here, which was used by the Institute for Creation Research for a few years on their Mount St. Helens tours. And then as I read through the voluminous literature, and it is voluminous, it became apparent there were several recurring principles or themes that surfaced over and over again. And I listed some of them here, and there are many more that could be listed. For example, the landscape, first and foremost, proved itself to be very resilient. Resilience in ecology is the ability of an ecosystem to recover from disturbance, and Mount St. Helens did that well. Secondly, it became obvious that the geological context, the geological stuff, was very important in how things recovered. So was weather and climate. So was whether there was abundant water or not in an area. The fifth one, the term biological legacies, was very important, and that's a term you may not have heard before because it was coined at Mount St. Helens. Biological legacies refers to biological materials, both living and dead, that went through the eruption. For example, a pocket gopher, a northern pocket gopher in a burrow under the ground that survived the eruption to live beyond the eruption then would be a biological legacy, a living biological legacy. A log that was felled from the forest and just lay there, perfectly dead, that would be a non-living biological legacy. And it turned out these legacies were one of the key features that enabled one to understand and interpret the recovery scene. There's many more things listed. I will return to those a little bit later on, so we'll pass on now. Concerning these themes, then, a big question to ask is, from our point of view here, is do these recovery themes illustrated at Mount St. Helens provide insight into how the Earth recovered biologically in the post-Noahic flood period? In other words, are there general principles that apply to many or even most major disturbances? With that, let me take you now through a tour of the blast zone. And in doing so, let me try to illustrate some of these themes. And then we're going to return to this question and try to relate this material to the time period following Noah's flood. So our excursion is going to begin in the crater. Now here's a telephoto view taken from the north. I think I took this on top of Harry's Ridge, looking into the crater. And you can see that the rim around the crater is horseshoe-shaped. It's intact to the east, the south, and the west, but blown out by that lateral blast to the north. And that, where it's missing, that's called the breach. It's an easy way into the crater. In the crater is a lava dome, a volcanic plug that developed right over the vent, a very thick, pasty lava that came out, didn't flow, it just built up a mound in there over a course of several years. And there's been more than one dome. In fact, from 2004 to 2008, another dome has developed behind this one, and so you'd actually see two of them in there today. The large canyon in the foreground is called Step Canyon, and there's also a glacier called Crater Glacier that's located in there. I think it's covered by snowpack, so I don't think you're really seeing the glacier here. Well, if you want a closer look in the crater, you've got two options unless you have access to a helicopter. And the first is to climb the south side of the mountain up to the rim, right at the middle of the rim in the center of the photograph there. And you would need a climbing permit, of course. Or you could hike up or climb up the slopes right in front of us here and just walk right into the crater up to the lava dome. So let me take you briefly on both of those excursions. Now here is our daughter Stacy climbing the south face of Mount St. Helens in the summer of 1998. And this is a trip led by John Hergenrather, I believe. Was Dennis with us as well? I think Dennis was with also, yes. And it was a group, that's Ruth Hazen behind Stacy there. So we climbed the south face of Mount St. Helens. Stacy later told me that was the hardest thing she'd ever done. I was kind of pleased to hear that. It was a challenge, but yet she did very well and made it to the top and had a good time. So we're at the top, and at the top there's a little path where people have been walking back and forth, and you can walk on that. We're facing to the east, and that's Mount Adams that you see. You wouldn't want to go off to the left on that snow cornice because it would probably give you a quick trip into the crater, which is also to the left. So that's an overhanging snow cornice. Here's Stacy again. And if Stacy would now just turn directly around and look to the north, here's what she would see. This is sort of the opposite view that I showed you, taken from Harry's Ridge. This is a view looking to the north, and there's Mount Rainier, there's Spirit Lake. You can see part of the blast zone out there. And the lava dome shows really well, and there's snowpack around it. I think you see a little glacier ice in the lower left, kind of grayish ice there. So this was a spectacular view. You get a clear day up there. It's a wonderful, wonderful trip. Now, one of my first recollections on reaching the summit was that of two ravens, which were flying from behind me, and they came to the crater, and they just suddenly swooped down into the crater. I thought that was just very dramatic, and somehow it stuck with me, how those birds seem to be having fun. We also saw many hummingbirds as we climbed the mountain, and they were feeding on nectar of alpine wildflowers. And back in 1980, just days after the eruption, geologists in bright orange flight suits were working in the crater, and they heard strange, sort of buzzy noises around them, didn't know what it was. And they finally figured out that they were being dive-bombed by hummingbirds, who probably thought the geologists were the biggest orange flowers they'd ever seen. So, now remember that we said that all birds in the blast zone were killed in the eruption. a million of them. In other words, concerning birds, there were no living biological legacies. Therefore, all bird recovery had to come by immigration, that is, the movement of birds from the surrounding forest or more distant areas into the devastated zone. And birds, of course, because of their ability to fly, are very adept at doing this. They can get in there very, very quickly, of course. You can contrast immigration of birds with something else like certain species of woodland salamanders. They are termed sedentary. They pretty much stay put. They don't move around much. And it would take eons for them to move in and colonize this blast zone. Well, immigration then, which I'm just illustrating here, is one of the important themes in the recovery story. And of course, that would be important in following Noah's flood as well, as we'll get to. There's another route into the crater. You follow Dr. Steve Austin up an erosion gully on the north side of the mountain. And you ascend along the step canyon that you saw from a distance. It's about 700 feet deep. It was eroded catastrophically following the eruption. Part of it's through solid lava flows. And then you come to the crater and look at all the life. Well, I put an arrow by the one little plant I could see on the photograph. There it is. I don't know if you can appreciate that. But the biggest evidence of life was the waters of Step Creek were green and filled with photosynthetic organisms, microscopic ones. Again, a basic principle is that aquatic systems recover far more rapidly than terrestrial ones. So if there's water, you get more rapid recovery. If it's drier, you don't. That's pretty intuitive, pretty obvious, but yet it explains a lot of the patterns that we see at Mount St. Helens. Several other organisms had been seen in the crater by the time this trip was in 1993, and included various insects and mice and Pacific tree frogs, of all things. A few bird species and some plants had been seen in there. But by and large, this is a pretty tough place for a recovery. In fact, I don't think you should call what happened in here recovery, because prior to the eruption, no life existed in this area because this was the inside of the mountain. And if you're familiar with the terminology of ecologists, you will recognize that what's happening in the crater is what's called primary succession. It's the colonization by life on a new surface where no life has existed previously. And that's a slow process. The same thing will be true on the lava flows from Kilauea in Hawaii. Those lava flows on the surface will be a surface where no life has existed, and so recovery of life there will be slow, and you can call that primary succession as well. Well, the crater is just plain inhospitable. It's cold with deep snowpack in the wintertime. It's dry like a desert in the summertime and hot. And it's geologically unstable. You can see the rockfall coming down there when we're in the crater. When you climb in there, you stay towards the center. You don't go underneath those cliffs. There were several rockfalls that came down. And so just another principle is that geological stability is required for biological recovery to occur. We will see that several places in the slides to follow. In other words, plants don't readily colonize collapsing crater walls, and they don't colonize valleys that are repeatedly scoured by floods. They need geological stability. Well, let's leave the crater now and visit the pumice plain. We'll go down here. And this is the area at the base of Mount St. Helens called the pumice plain. And in contrast to the crater, where nothing lived before the eruption, this was the old-growth forest I showed you previously. And this photo here is taken a little bit after the eruption because it's got some erosion in it. It was much more a flat surface right after the eruption. But this forest, this old-growth forest, was blasted, incinerated, deeply buried up to 600 feet in deposits. Nothing survived. And so this surface here was also would also produce recovery by primary succession. There was nothing there, no life at all on that surface. And this is a type of barren substrate upon which life recovered and is recovering at Mount St. Helens. It's called desert pavement. The high winds tend to blow the ash, the fine particles away. They leave the coarser pumice fragments, forming a fairly stable surface. But there is a problem here, and the problem is that volcanic deposits like these lack the nutrients that plants need, particularly nitrogen. dacite, the material that was erupted, was very poor in nitrogen. But even on these nutrient-poor surfaces, life is returning. And since there were no surviving organisms, of course, the life that returns has to come by immigration from the surrounding forest, for example, or areas where there's survivors. And so all organisms here are either immigrants or descendants of immigrants. And the first plant to appear on the pumice plain, and they know the exact plant, was one like this called prairie lupin. You're familiar with lupin. This is a high elevation form of it. It was found in the summer of 1982 by researchers Charlie Crisafulli and James McMahon. And this is Charlie Crisafulli. He's an ecologist working with the monument, one of the most knowledgeable, productive people in doing these ecological studies. I had the pleasure of spending a day in the field with him several years ago, and he's an amazing guy. Well, Charlie's lupin proved very prolific. By 1989, there were 169,000 progeny, and he hasn't counted them all. And it's similar to what is shown here on the different site. This is the Plains of Abraham, but it's similar appearance. The lupin was very prolific. Now, lupin is a very important pioneer plant. Perhaps you are familiar with that, but it's very important in developing a community, a living community, because what it does is it fixes nitrogen. Nitrogen is not broken, no, but by the term, what lupin does is it has nodules on its roots, and in those nodules live certain types of bacteria which are able to take nitrogen from the air and turn it into chemical compounds that plants can use, because plants can't use the nitrogen, it's in the air. So essentially these lupin plants and their associated bacteria make fertilizer. And they add it to these nutrient-poor pumice deposits, and this helps the lupin, but it also prepares the site for the coming of other plants, like the conifer trees, which can't fix nitrogen. So here's another example of this. There's two main forms of alder up there, Sitka alder and red alder, and they are also nitrogen-fixing plants. And so what we see here is the development of soil. The rock is weathering and forming the mineral component of soil, and the alder leaves, which contain nitrogen, are putting nitrogen into that developing soil, and of course organic materials of other sorts. And in fact, whole mountainsides at this time are covered by dense stands of red alder like this. Huge areas are. And so in a decade or two or three, the conifer trees will be taking over from these alder, benefiting from the enrichment of the soil that the alder provided. Many other plants are reclaiming the pumice plain. Here's a struggling fir of some sort. Actually, what this is the beginning of an old-growth forest. It just has a ways to go. And here's a lonely lodgepole pine, and this plant's called partridge foot. And here's my favorite one. It's called pussy paws. The floral structures lie flat on the ground, which is a good adaptation if you live in such a windy environment. By far, the fastest recovery on this barren pumice plain, however, is where there's water. Where the streams go across the pumice plain, their recovery is much more rapid. This is Lewis monkey flower, a pumice plain plant found only along the water courses. Well, let's go to an even greater than example of aquatic-related recovery. That is Spirit Lake. So Spirit Lake died on May 18th, 1980. The lake is, of course, located just north of Mount St. Helens, and the pumice plain forms its south shore. So on the morning of May 18th, about a third of that debris avalanche, the big avalanche from the top and north side of Mount St. Helens, about a third of it plowed directly into Spirit Lake. And it caused the waters of the lake to slosh out onto the mountains to the north, up to about 800 feet. And there was a wave or waves, and those waves, as they sloshed over the mountains, picked up an entire old-growth forest. The trees, about 1 million of them, the soil, other plants, animals, everything. And they swirled around, and they carried it back into Spirit Lake. But while the waters were out of the lake, that debris avalanche had created a new bottom to the lake, 200 feet higher than the old one. So it was a very rapid transformation of Spirit Lake. And later in the day, oven-hot pyroclastic flows boiled into the south shore, flowing out of the mountain crater right down into the lake as well. The first helicopter cruise, one piloted by Michael Cairns, who some of you may have met. He spoke at a creation meeting a few years ago up in Longview, I believe. Anyways, he flew over the site of Spirit Lake and says he couldn't see any water. He didn't see the lake. And that got reported, and that's why on the back we have the headline of the Oregonian from the day after the eruption. It says, Spirit Lake gone. Well, it's not gone, but it was covered. It was hidden, because on it was a floating forest, 1 million logs, and also floating rock. The rock up there floats. Not only does the soil fall out of the sky, but the rock floats. So it's kind of a strange place. But pumice is full of air bubbles, and we've got some in the back. You can see how it floats at break. So when scientists returned to Spirit Lake, they reported it had been, quotes, transformed into a roiling, steaming body of degraded water choked with logs and mud. Now, it was much worse than what you see here, because this is a little while after the eruption, but I couldn't get a picture that was perfect for immediately after. They predicted then it would take 10, 20, or many more years perhaps to get back to an original water quality condition. And it took less than 5, so it was quicker than anticipated. How was Spirit Lake then reborn? And it's kind of a complicated story involving microbiology and chemistry and physical processes, but just a brief version goes like this. Following the eruption, the waters of Spirit Lake were warm. They were saturated with organic debris from that forest, and they had a lot of mineral nutrients. And in this brew, bacteria and bacteria-like organisms proliferated to just an astounding degree. So much that they used up all the oxygen in the lake's water. And so with the oxygen gone, the only organisms in the lake that could live would be anaerobic microorganisms, those that don't require bacteria or don't require oxygen. The lake was said to boil like a cauldron from escaping carbon dioxide, methane, hydrogen sulfide generated by these organisms, and the odor was overwhelming. Some researchers became ill as they did their work around Spirit Lake, and they called it the red zone fever, and it possibly was a form of Legionnaire's disease, because that bacteria, Legionella, was found at that time in Spirit Lake. But then after that, those extreme conditions, due to a succession of bacterial types and physical processes, the lake recovered. Things like wind and waves and winter rain and sunshine and so forth. Spirit Lake started to heal, and within 5 years it had reached a pristine water quality again. The first rainbow trout, here's a picture afterwards, somewhat well into the recovery, or probably when it's pretty much recovered. And the first rainbow trout was found in 1992. It was promptly named Harry. You can guess why. Of course, no fish could have survived in those anoxic conditions in the lake, so it didn't survive in the lake. The question is, where did Harry and his kin come from? And the prevailing opinion is that someone illegally stocked Spirit Lake. And the fish are still there, and they're doing very well. Well, here, let's leave Spirit Lake and just move a little further out on our gradient of disturbance, where things are not quite as disturbed, maybe, although still pretty much so. This is the debris avalanche deposit on land. So we talked about that debris avalanche coming off the mountain. Part plows into Spirit Lake. Well, part of it also went up and over a ridge, a 1,000-foot ridge, which is now called Johnston Ridge. And so here you can see these mounds or hummocks, which are semi-intact parts of Mount St. Helens, and they extend up this ridge and they go over the top and down the other side. The rest of this debris avalanche, or the bulk of it, of course, went 14 miles down the North Fork Toutle River, where it sits today. But anyways, this picture here is of the spillover where the hummocks went over Johnston Ridge. Now, again, this landslide was cool. It wasn't hot like the other materials, and so a little bit of plant material survives. That's why I'm saying we're going a little bit out on our gradient of disturbance here, not quite as an intense a place. You can see in this photograph a couple other things. The plants are recovering really well at the bottom. Well, why? Well, there's a stream there. So again, plants recover by the streams. You can see the plants are doing very poorly, or not at all, on the surface of that hummock because it's a rapidly eroding, unstable geologic surface. And so plants will not recover there until that situation changes. Let me tell you one other thing about this site that I think is interesting. A geologist named Fred Swenson, not Don Swenson, he was the head geologist for a while, but Fred Swenson, he was working on the debris avalanche May 28th, 10 days after the eruption. And as geologists do, he was digging holes in these deposits, looking at the layers and so forth. And he saw something that puzzled him, that he couldn't explain. The pumice was all infiltrated with filaments. It looked like spider filaments all over the place. He didn't know what they were. He later found out that what he was looking at were the filaments of a fungus, which would be a so-called fire fungus. You know, in our forest fires, some fungi germinate after the heat of a fire, and so then they grow well for a while, and you can see the mushrooms out there. And so this was that type of a fungus that was in these debris avalanche deposits, and the heat of the eruption heated them up enough that they germinated and produced these just mats of filaments. Turns out those start stabilizing these deposits. Those fungi also formed mats of material on the surface. Mosses colonized those, and then other plants colonized where the mosses were. So it looks like this whole system is designed to have mechanisms for recovery from disturbance, like maybe somebody thought this through ahead of time. Here's an erosion gully, and as you expect, geologically unstable. Plants aren't doing very well in the erosion gully, but they're doing much better on the stable surfaces. That there are exceptions to this, and here's an exception. Early in recovery, it was the opposite. On the stable surfaces of pumice, there's nothing recovering, but in the erosion gullies where water washed or eroded down to the old soil level, well, that's where the plant's roots were, and so the plants recovered in the erosion gullies exclusively. So the exact opposite occurred early on, kind of a curious thing. Notice that among these hummocks, there's a lot of ponds, wetlands, so the eruption destroyed a lot of habitat, but also created a lot of new habitat. And these wetlands are very productive. Lots of plants live here, the cattails, for example, the willows and the duckweed, horsetail. Here's a not so desirable one called Eurasian milfoil that's abundant. It's non-native and it crowds out other plants. How did it get there? Well, it flew, because this stuff attaches to ducks' feet, and the ducks come in and they bring it to the blast zone. When you look through the vegetation around these ponds, you find evidence of animal life. Here's a moth caterpillar on a willow leaf, and here's a dragonfly, and there's a red-legged frog looking out of the pond there. And find these cute little tree frogs. That's a Pacific tree frog, the type that ended up in the crater. And here's a better look at it. Sometimes the ponds of these little wetlands in the hummocky areas are just, the shores are just black with tadpoles, and these are western toad tadpoles. Here they are recently metamorphosed, coming out onto the land. And there were huge numbers of these toads and other organisms as well at times. There would be populations would just explode in a great abundance because they didn't have predators, for example. But then they would crash because they didn't have enough food either. And so one researcher reported hiking along and seeing a hillside in front of him that looked like it was just moving. And getting closer, he found the whole hillside was toads, just hopping toe to toe. So boom and bust population dynamics was common. Main reptile you might find is a garter snake. Here's a closer view of him. And early in the recovery, in the debris avalanche deposit area, there were no trees, of course, so the birds that nested there had to be ground nesting birds. Birds came in when they had suitable habitat, and this was suitable habitat for like the dark-eyed junco, which is this nest is of, and here's the end result at raising young. The wetlands brought in birds like wetlands, like the red-winged blackbird. Also on these debris avalanche deposits, you find trees that look like this, kind of strange. Wouldn't pick it for your Christmas tree, probably. But again, an animal is causing the trees to look like bonsai trees here. And here's some markings on alder saplings from the same animal, and here's another sure sign of the animal. Nice composition, I thought. And here the animal left its track, and you probably know what it is by now. Sometimes in the spring you find the bones laying around. And of course it's the Roosevelt elk. And the elk, 1,500 were killed. Elk are too big to hide any place, so every one of them was killed that was in the blast zone, but they have returned. And elk play a big role in recovery of plants. First of all, they set back plant recovery by browsing and trampling, but they also aid plant recovery. For example, they eat plant material outside in the forests, and then they walk into the blast zone, and in their droppings they leave seeds of various plants. And so many plants have been moved into the blast zone by elk. Charlie Crisafulli, who I mentioned, for a period of time was collecting elk droppings on the pumice plain where the elk congregate each fall. And he would take the elk droppings, put them in plastic bags, and take them home and put them in his refrigerator. Well labeled, I hope. And he would leave them there for a couple of months to simulate winter and then plant them, and he figured out all the different species of plants that were coming in with the elk. The other thing that elk do is they create flower pots. Their tracks in the soft pumice deposits, the tracks are fairly deep, and in those tracks, water accumulates, so it tends to be moist at the bottom. Also, organic material and seeds blow into the tracks, and the seeds germinate, and so you have little tiny oases of plant recovery where the elk tracks are oftentimes. And I think with that, we should take a break.
If you're heading to the Grand Canyon for vacation this year, don't be surprised if you run into a few crowds. Nearly 5 million people from all over the world visit this wonder of nature every year. That's over 100 times more people than when the park officially opened in 1919. Researchers also come to the 277-mile canyon to study the spectacular rock formations, fossils, and archaeological discoveries. Scientists still debate how long it took for the canyon to form, with many insisting that it took several million years for the Colorado River to carve its way through. But other geologists think it's much younger, and another famous North American landmark shows why. In 1982, just 2 years after Mount St. Helens erupted, another seismic episode in the area shook loose the unstable rock and created a fast-moving mud flow that carved a canyon near the mountain's base. Scientists have called it the Little Grand Canyon because it looks like a 1/40th scale model of Arizona's Grand Canyon. What's amazing about the Little Grand Canyon is that it formed quickly through a small catastrophic event. Scientists now see how larger canyons, like Grand Canyon, could be quickly created through a massive catastrophic event, like the global flood of Noah's day. And that's something to think about while you're dodging the crowds at the Grand Canyon to get a glimpse of this magnificent monument to the power of our Creator.
Okay, well, here we are back again. You saw the Little Grand Canyon in that little clip, which is a good illustration of rapid canyon formation that was seen at Mount St. Helens. It's not it's not something you can see terribly easily when you just go and visit the monument. You kind of have to look at an angle at it. We have had some trips where we hike into it, but it requires a special use permit, and Steve Austin has obtained that on occasion. So, anyways. So let's now move from the areas we've been talking about to the big area that occupies much of that blast zone, which is the blowdown forest zone. I think that's an amazing photograph right there, just showing you the intense power of that blast to knock down all of those trees. And of course, it was 230 square miles of trees that were devastated in, some say 3 minutes, some say, well, less than 10 minutes. But in a few minutes, all that happened. So the power of the volcano was impressive. Huge amounts of biological material, both living and dead, persisted in this blowdown forest zone. These, of course, are biological legacies, and they greatly accelerated recovery in this zone. An important principle is that biological legacies, the material that either living or dead that goes through the eruption to emerge on the other side, they were probably the most important factor in determining the rate of early recovery in the blast zone. Also in the blowdown forest zone, there were places where lingering snowpack existed, and this insulated and protected many organisms, allowing them to survive. For example, in this basin here, which probably many of you have visited, it's the Meta Lake Basin. In May of 1980, this was old-growth forest, and it was still partially covered by snow, and the lake was covered by ice. But under the snowpack in that old-growth forest were small Pacific silver firs, kind of bent over and buried in the snow. And so the blast comes along, and it takes down all the old-growth trees, but it opens up the canopy, it opens up the whole area to sunlight for those surviving Pacific silver firs, the legacy. And they take over. And this was in the 1990s this was taken. They're much bigger now, but they're growing rapidly and will become the next forest of that area. Brook trout also survived at Meta Lake because the lake was ice covered. Also, the critter that many of you have seen just a few minutes ago, we've got a big northwestern salamander there in the back. Northwestern salamanders survived, many in larval form and that, but in Meta Lake, because, again, the lake was covered with ice and protected, and they were oftentimes in the mud at the bottom of the pond, of that lake. And it's remarkable, I think, that some of these amphibians, such as the western toad I mentioned, and this particular salamander here, I also mentioned some that are sedentary, that don't move around much, but this is not one of them. These have dispersed great distances, even kilometers, and are now found in some of the ponds at the base of Mount St. Helens. So the question is, how can a delicate amphibian that requires water like this traverse all these pumice deposits? And a couple of things have been learned, of course. Many of them attempted the journey and died, but there are 2 times during the year when they were successful, with the spring rains and with the fall rains, when the landscape was, as it's said to be, permeable. It was wet, and they were able to cross. The other thing that these creatures did is they took the subway, where it's cooler down below. And the subway was made by northern pocket gophers, and the pocket gophers have made an intricate network of tunnels throughout the area. And so many of these traveled for part of the distance, at least, in the tunnels made by pocket gophers. I've had the experience of looking down pocket gopher holes and seeing western toads looking back at me. Here's evidence of the northern pocket gopher, some of the tailings that you commonly see. Here's the critter himself, and I know Steve has a picture in the back he was showing. The pocket gopher is a real hero in the recovery story. You think of gophers as being destructive in your garden, but here it was very helpful, because these pocket gophers, being underground, often survived as legacies. After the eruption, they burrowed to the surface through these volcanic deposits and brought up the old soil and make mounds on top of the pumice deposits. And those mounds not only contain the old soil, but seeds and fragments of roots and so forth. So like the elk tracks became little oases of plant recovery, these pocket gopher mounds became oases of plant recovery as well. And then plants could move out from those areas. Numerous species of forest plants survived, like the avalanche lily, the bunchberry. These are forest plants that were in that forest before the eruption. Wood violet. An interesting question is, which would have recovered more quickly? You can think about this, the clear cuts or the old growth forest. And as you think about it, you'd realize the clear cuts should recover first, as we see here. Why is that? Well, they were already recovering. They were clear cut and they had pioneer plants that are accustomed to sunlight and so forth, already growing there. And so like fireweed is shown here, and that simply had to penetrate through the barrier of the ash and emerge. And so they started to recover more quickly than the old growth forest, which did not have pioneer plants already there. The old growth forests, of course, they recovered well also, but it just took a little more time to get them going. There's the fireweed again. Fireweed was one of the sort of iconic plants of early recovery. It dispersed all over and grew well, and it was all over the place. Huckleberries have returned, delicious to eat. Let's move now to the bugs. And here's a snowberry checker spot butterfly, but certainly some insects survived. Some insects survived. But probably most are colonizers. And why did insects, most of them actually died in there, and why would that be? In fact, we had a statement here by one of the researchers. He said this: there seems to be justification to believe that it would be impossible for insects to recover at all. That's a bit of an overstatement, but he's thinking of some factor involved here. And what he's thinking of is the fact that volcanic ash is an insecticide. The dry, fresh volcanic ash, the stuff like in the jar in the back, when it falls on various arthropods, insects, millipedes, so forth, it abrades the cuticle, the outer waxy covering, and they tend to desiccate, they lose water, and they can just dry up and die. The other thing it does, it clogs their respiratory little pores or spiracles, and it clogs their intestinal tracts. So the ash was quite a potent insecticide and controlled insect populations. There was a lot of concern with all the standing dead trees that the bark beetles are going to take over the dead trees and then move on to the living trees and be a problem. Never materialized because, that's attributed to the effective, the insecticide nature of this ash. Grasshoppers, plentiful, and many herbivorous insects help control plant populations, which can be very helpful. Here's a tiger beetle. You meet these hiking on the trail oftentimes. It's very awkward to have to get down with your camera and try to photograph them when the next hiker comes. They wonder what you're up to, but that's an aggressive predator beetle. Spiders are fairly common, or quite common. You might say, how did spiders get into the blast zone? Most of them would not have survived, but how would they get in, like even to the pumice plain where nothing survived? Did they just crawl in on all eights or what? And the answer is they dispersed by ballooning. They flew in. A fair number of spider species, a large percent of them in fact, disperse as juveniles by crawling out on branches of shrubs and trees, and on a breezy day they let out a long length of silk, spider silk, and let go, and the silk acts like a parachute or a balloon and transports them up to kilometers in distance. So during the summer season, they felt that about 2 million spiders were falling per square mile each day on the blast zone. Good reason to wear a hat when you're up there, I guess. A lot of spiders came in. Numerous birds have dispersed, as we've already alluded to, certainly into this blowdown forest zone. The birds that hammer on dead wood for a living, going after insects, like woodpeckers, this was woodpecker heaven, I guess. It was just great for them. And I wanted to get a picture of the northern flicker, which is one of the woodpeckers, and the best I could do is this. There's its cavity, and there's the picture of the flicker. It's a flicker feather, but best I could do. Very common also is the mountain bluebird, quite beautiful because they nest in cavities built by woodpeckers. They're secondary cavity dwellers, and so they've returned. So birds return when they've got the proper habitat requirements met. 27,000 formerly blue grouse, now called sooty grouse, died in the eruption. They are back and doing well. Here's a courtship display from a male. Lastly, mammal species have returned to the blowdown forest. No, this is not a chipmunk. It's a golden-mantled ground squirrel. You can tell it has no face stripe like a chipmunk, and it's too big. So these ground squirrels are doing very well. There's another evidence of a mammal that abounds now along the ponds and streams, and we have some of that evidence in the back, and these, of course, are beaver-cut logs here. And the beavers, there were no surviving beavers in the blast zone that I'm aware of, but what the beaver did is they waited for the plants to recover along the streams, and they literally ate their way up the streams and eventually into the blast zone, where now they are abundant, and they, again, as beavers do, they create wetland habitat for other species. Here's a beaver dam in the foreground there of Meta Creek. Black-tailed deer have returned. We're now getting to the far edge of that blast zone, to where I had the hatch marks, the scorch zone, or the zone of the standing dead. Here the lateral blast was still hot enough to cook the trees and kill them, but they remained standing. And here it is again. Each winter, this blast zone edge has fewer and fewer standing trees because they're coming down, but there's still a lot of them up there. And if you go beyond the scorch zone, you come to the intact forest, where the trees were still standing and they have lived. But for many months, much of this forest was covered by this adherent sort of ash material that coated them. And so they were retarded in their growth, and they suffered effects from the blast, but yet they survived. And then if you go beyond that, you come just to the ashfall zone, and when you go beyond that, you come to the intact forest, which is really untouched. This is a cedar flat forest off to the edge, and it wasn't touched. So this has taken us then through this gradient of disturbance, from the most intensely disturbed area by the mountain, and then on outward, where we're getting less and less disturbance, and finally we come to where there is no disturbance, such as in this forest. So that's the end of our tour of the blast zone, and so now that brings us back to the question that I asked before. Do the recovery themes illustrated at Mount St. Helens provide insight into how the Earth recovered biologically in the post-Noahic flood period? And if so, what might that insight be? Very interesting. Of late, there's been some literature emerging on a sort of a new discipline in ecology called volcano ecology that's spawned by the research done at Mount St. Helens. Here's a quote from the Pacific Northwest Research Station of the Forest Service. It says, "The in-depth ecological research on Mount St. Helens and at other volcanoes is enabling researchers to identify universal themes in the ecosystem response to disturbance." In other words, what they're saying is the secular community believes that the recovery themes observed at Mount St. Helens have general, even, quotes, universal applicability to other disturbances. And should not that include something like Noah's flood? Here's a quote from Charlie Crisafulli, again, along the same line. And he's comparing Mount St. Helens with the eruptions of Krakatoa in 1883, and then more recently the island of Surtsey that was formed off the coast of Iceland. And he says, we can tease out idiosyncrasies of individual eruptions versus overarching generalities. The biological agents may vary, but the ecosystem processes may be quite similar. So he's saying we can study something at one volcano and find out in a different part of the world the same processes are occurring with an eruption. Maybe there's different species of plants and animals, but still it's very similar. And then they go on to say that, this probably applies, what we learn here, to other disturbances as well, beyond volcanic eruptions. So again, it's an encouragement, this literature, to consider, to extend what we learn at Mount St. Helens to something like Noah's flood, and it seems to be a reasonable thing to do. It's also important to realize that there are several similarities between Noah's flood and what happened at Mount St. Helens. Both were catastrophic geologic events involving volcanism, flooding, massive erosion, and deposition. In each, there was destruction of a pre-disturbance ecosystem. Biological legacies were abundant in both events, and in both the processes that followed, the responses led to biological recovery. Just one example of catastrophic geologic events, it says volcanism. Well, what about Yellowstone National Park? I've been studying that lately. We're going there shortly, and that whole park is most of it is volcanic material, and much of it is a caldera 30 to 40 miles across. That's like Mount St. Helens. And so that's something that developed in the late flood or early post-flood period, and that whole volcanic area had to recover. Would not that recovery at Yellowstone mimic very much what we see occurring at the volcano we call Mount St. Helens? You would think so. Here are 8 of the themes. There's several more we could put down here, but here are 8 of them that I just want to comment on briefly. And the first one is resilience of ecosystems. Severely disturbed ecosystems at Mount St. Helens are recovering well. They are very resilient. And this is, again, the overarching observation or conclusion at the mountain. And it lends credibility to the idea that the entire Earth actually could recover following a global cataclysm like Noah's flood. The next concept is biological legacies. And legacies of the flood, now, logically would include things like this. In the ark would be man, land animals, and what I call hitchhikers, that is incidental microbes, fungi, seeds, spores, bugs, etc. And so those are the things on the ark that survived. In the floodwaters, fishes, amphibians, aquatic invertebrates, and aquatic plants would have done well, and other things. There likely would have been, certainly there would have been floating vegetation mats or log mats, just like there were on Spirit Lake. The Earth was highly forested, you can tell from the fossil record, and certainly there would have been huge mats of floating forest and other plant material during the flood. And on those mats would not plants and fungi and seed and spores and insects and perhaps other things survive as well. There also likely would have been pumice rafts during the flood. We see those today in the Pacific Ocean. A volcano erupts under the water, and on the surface you get this huge mass of floating pumice that persists for a long time and can travel hundreds of miles. And it's been documented there are marine organisms that live on those, and I would think that insects would likely colonize those as well. And so that could be another area of survival and of transport of organisms. In the atmosphere, tiny spores, very tiny seeds, certain insects, they can remain aloft a long time, and certain things probably persisted simply in the air. And then also buried in the flood sediments. We talked about at Noah's flood, or that things got buried in sediments at Mount St. Helens. Well, during the flood, plant material and even animal material like clams or mollusks and things will be buried in the sediments. Could they not survive for a period of time and become legacies as well? Think about this. Following the flood then, imagine that you would have a huge log mat containing all kinds of plant material and the organisms that are associated with that. As the floodwaters go down, that log mat would ground. It would be land on the ground someplace, and then that whole area would become what is termed at Mount St. Helens a hot spot of recovery. It would be a hot spot with fairly rapid recovery because there's all those legacies deposited in that one place, and so it's likely that would have happened after the flood. Well, immigration after the flood must have involved both short distance and long distance travel. For example, from this hotspot illustration, organisms could simply advance outward from a biological hotspot into the surrounding region and establish and colonize. But man and land animals and other things on the ark, well, they immigrated from a point source, from the ark in the mountains of Ararat, and then had to travel up to distances equal to the global distances. Notice also that long distance travel would take some time, and that would have allowed plants, invertebrates, fishes, and other organisms that were in the floodwaters, not on the ark, to be well established by the time the immigrants from the ark arrived. Thus, many of the animals and man even would be spreading out into an area that was already recovering fairly well and providing food source for, say, many of the animals that would eat insects or plants or such. We next have the requirement for some geological stability, and I think we can readily envision that the immediate post-flood world was a very geologically active place, with the breaching of natural dams, with local flooding, with landslides, with dust storms, with rivers changing courses, and a lot of volcanic activity. And plants would probably not establish in such geologically active areas until that activity had ceased, and then they would be able to have the stability they need to recover. So certain areas would be rapid to recover, like with the grounding of a log mat. Some would be very slow, that is where there was a lot of instability geologically. On the other hand, one type of geologic process, erosion, may well have facilitated recovery by digging down into the flood deposits after Noah's flood and exposing buried plants and certain animals that could survive burial, like, say, clams and snails and things of that sort that might have been unearthed by the erosion after the flood. And it would be similar to the erosion gullies we saw at Mount St. Helens. Aquatic habitats certainly would likely recover quicker than the drier areas post-flood, and I think this is pretty much a universal principle. But think about what we said about Spirit Lake. Spirit Lake was a degraded body of water to the extreme. Would not all bodies of water on the whole earth be rather degraded after Noah's flood? They wouldn't be crystal clear drinking water. They'd be muddy and have bacterial and other organisms and plant material and all kinds of things going on. So would not the aquatic systems, particularly the freshwater ones, would they not have to recover in some sort of a similar way as happened with Spirit Lake? You would think so. You would think so. Volcanic ash controls insect populations. After the flood, insects some populations would have probably exploded in numbers. They would have lacked, for example, some of their main predators like birds and bats and small rodents. They would take a little time to disperse out from the ark. So the insecticide ash from erupting post-flood volcanoes likely would have been a control over insect populations. One would think it would be similar to what happened at Mount St. Helens. And lastly, I put down humans. We must remember that humans play a role in biological responses to disturbance. At Mount St. Helens, humans salvaged, logged, planted conifer seedlings, built roads, sowed grass seed to control erosion, stabilized Spirit Lake with a drainage tunnel, and established a national monument, which basically says, let's leave this land alone. But that's, again, a human decision. So all these activities affected recovery. In a similar fashion, post-flood man would have hunted, developed agriculture, built roads, houses, and probably even intentionally transported animals and plants to different sites. So as we look at this sort of thing, what we try to do is to think about what happened in the past, and we're not there and we can't see what happened in the past, so it has to be somewhat speculative. But if we're going to try to build some sort of a reasonable model on how the Earth could have recovered biologically following Noah's flood, it seems like Mount St. Helens provides at least a good starting place and provides some good information to get us thinking, I would think, in the right direction, because we've seen these processes and we understand something about what happened at St. Helens, and I think we can export much of that knowledge to an understanding of what happened following Noah's flood to build a good model of that event. We can have some questions in just a bit. I want to mention a couple of add-ons before we go, and then we can have some little discussion of things, but I wanted to mention a couple of things that are happening at Mount St. Helens here. So what's wrong with this elk? Well, you can see it's holding its hind limb, not putting any weight on it. And many elk in southwest Washington, including in the blast zone of Mount St. Helens, have developed a severe hoof disease, which is painfully disabling. And here are some fairly normal hooves on the left, but look at the grotesquely distorted structures on the right. And this is overgrowth of the hoof. And it causes pain, and they're unable to walk well, and they become easy prey for predators, of course. So it's really a pretty terrible disease. And the cause is felt currently to be due to a bacterium called a treponeme bacterium, and they feel it's probably transmitted through wet soil, and there seems to be no practical way of doing anything about it in free-ranging elk herds. Except they're asking hunters to leave the hooves where they find them, not take them out of the area, and they're studying the situation. So it's kind of a sad situation concerning the elk. But let's look on a more positive note at something else that's happening up there. Larry Bittner, are you here? You're there. I can hear you. Oh, there you are. I see. Larry was hiking on the Plains of Abraham on the east side of Mount St. Helens, and took some photographs that he sent me. And there's one of them. You look quickly, sometimes you see, well, there's some snow patches up there, but those snow patches move. So those are mountain goats. Recall an guesstimated 15 mountain goats were killed in the eruption. No one knows how many exactly, but that was just a guess. Fairly small number. And no goats were reliably documented on Mount St. Helens until about 2003, although there's some anecdotal reports. After that, reporting of goats seen by hikers, for example, has become increasingly common. Some surveys have been done on the ground, and then finally an aerial survey was done in 2017. They found 250 mountain goats on and around Mount St. Helens. They've exploded. So Larry took another picture here, and that's a great shot, isn't it? You can see the beard on the goat there, and the horns and so forth. There's no reasonable expectation or reasonable thoughts that these goats survived the eruption. They appear to have dispersed from other sources. And I heard a talk recently with the Mount St. Helens Institute, and the ecologist there was describing, he's I think leading the investigations on this. He feels that the goats have dispersed from possibly Mount Adams, Mount Rainier, or closer, such as some place called Goat Rocks, which is a place in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, places where there are goats. And their goats are able to disperse through the forest. They have wildlife cameras that document that. And they've arrived at Mount St. Helens. And of course, Mount St. Helens has become a huge open goat habitat area because the trees are gone. It's just what they like. They like treeless mountain environment. And the tribes are really happy about this. The Cowlitz and the Salish and other Northwest tribes are delighted because historically the indigenous peoples have gathered wool shed by these goats. Either they hunt the goat or the boys would go up and collect the wool from the plant material. It says when they shed, they rub against plants, and so they collected it, and they had the tradition of sewing these or weaving these beautiful blankets, and they're anticipating they can resume some of that activity on Mount St. Helens. Our last field trip to Lewitt and Step Canyon, coming out of there, Ruth Hazen actually spotted 20 goats on the mountain that we saw at some distance. And we actually found a little bit of wool as well. Well, that's probably enough said on my part, and so I'll conclude. And we can have some questions and discussions, and if you have any ideas on how this stuff at Mount St. Helens might relate to Noah's flood, I'd like to hear it. So let's just take a few minutes and talk things over. So thank you.